It's tricky because it's so close to our hearts. We wounded. We haven't experienced a situation where our dignity might have been violated. Or we feeling guilty, maybe even some shame that we responded in such a way to that other, that we actually violated the dignity of that other, and now we find ourselves not knowing what to do. So either way, whether we are the perpetrator or we're the one who has experienced harm, we're in this difficult place, in a very emotional place, in a very fragile place, in a place where we're doing some deep thinking, right, about what has happened. And we've been talking to one another about this process. And at least for me, it's been very freeing, because the reality of it is that these things are indeed a process that takes time. And it's good to know, because so often in my own life, I felt a need to hurry it up, thinking that forgiveness is this point in time that I need to hurry. But I hope that in these weeks together, you've at least recognized that this is indeed a process, and that this process has no timetable in it. For after all, just like Jacob and Esau, the layers of the struggle have been thick. In other words, lots has happened that got us to this place. Not just that event, maybe, but a series of unfortunate events that got us to where we are. And so one of the things today, as we continue to discuss this process that we call forgiveness, is a recognition that there's no timetable, that it's going to take time, and that we must take time, because what has happened has meant something. So a few weeks ago, we discussed the first step of this journey, and that journey began because we made a decision about healing. And we said the first step was to tell the story. And if you're the one who has perpetrated violence against another, is a space where you hear the story, right? You're willing to sit with that other before you. And then step two, we said, was naming the harm. And we talked about last week how it would be so easy, right, for you to just gloss over what's happened and not be specific. If you're the one who has felt the violation, it's so easy to just skip over the difficult portions of it. And if you're the one who's been the perpetrator, you sometimes don't want to hear it because you feel guilty or ashamed. And yet, in order for healing to happen, we must indeed be willing to name the harm and hear the harm that has been done to us. So now we're here at this moment where there is as Tutu tells us, granting forgiveness. Because forgiveness is something that begins with those whose dignity has been violated, who have been hurt or harmed or have suffered loss. And it's truly part of their own agency, whether they grant it or they do not grant it. Now think about this. In Tutu's work, granting forgiveness is the third of 4 steps towards healing. So stay tuned for next week as we discuss that next step, because it's pivotal to it. But for today, for this moment, is this idea of granting forgiveness. And this idea of granting forgiveness in this healing process begins by a recognition. You might remember that we either choose to heal or choose to continue the violent cycle, right? And there's a little step in the cycle of violence that's pivotal to our conversation today. Because in that aspect of it, we begin to be so hurt that we begin to dehumanize that other who's perpetrated violence against us, who has harmed us or hurt us in any way. That other is truly an other. They're no longer a human being with dreams and hopes and ideas and experiences themselves. They now become a thing that we hate, a thing that we want to get back at, a thing that doesn't deserve to live in the world, even in the most extreme circumstances, a thing that we might ignore or ghost, a thing that we dream about no longer being part of this ecosystem that is life. And so in granting forgiveness, part of the important process in this step that we're talking about today is that granting forgiveness depends on us humanizing that other that has harmed, hurt, or caused us loss. A recognition that they are human beings, persons that have value and dignity in and of themselves, no longer labeled by the things they have done, but the recognition that they are beloved ones too, beloved ones that are human. This is why Tutu doesn't like us to label even highly violent people as monsters, because he says that dehumanizes them and doesn't help us actually be able to enter into a process of healing. Also, when we call another a monster, we do something else. So in the process of granting forgiveness, we're humanizing that other. And part of that humanizing of the other means that we recognize that that other has agency. Just like we have agency to grant that forgiveness, the other has agency too. They have agency to do differently. They have agency to live differently. They have agency to no longer be a people that are creating this violence against the others, no matter their circumstance. And so in granting forgiveness, we're humanizing that other. We're also humanizing ourselves. We're recognizing our humanity. That we too, even on our better days, can have a tendency to harm or hurt another. That we are not perfect. So we too have agency here also. And in that re-energizing of that agency, we can begin to take kind of power back so that our future might be better. And that future is better within that recognition, within that moment. In Jacob and Esau's story, it begins by Jacob experiencing some things in his own life. He too experienced being tricked. He experienced what it was like to be taken advantage of. He experienced what it was like to be seen as an other. Just like he saw Esau as another to be used and abused and manipulated, he was used and abused and manipulated. And it is part of that experience that he had that began to open his eyes to what had happened with his brother. And so for all of us today, if we're to be a people that are granting forgiveness, it begins with that recognition that we too are human. We too mess up. We too are in desperate need to be forgiven. And because of that, we begin to take some power back. No longer just a victim of something that has happened to us, but now having agency to begin to move beyond that victimization, beyond that labeling that we might even give ourselves, into a new day where we can take charge of our lives and be freed from the burden that is that which has happened to us in our own lives. And so granting forgiveness is not just a process of letting go, really, which we'll talk about next week a bit, but it's a process of our growing awareness and a process of taking ownership over our own lives in light of the recognition that we're human. And in the end, granting forgiveness does one more thing. It doesn't just free us from the burden of what's happened, but in some real miraculous way, in a gift of grace, it begins to pave a new future. A more humble future, but also a future where we walk each and every day into the world as a person who is more compassionate, more just, as a person who has more loving kindness. In the same way that holding on to the hurt and harm or loss might make us bitter and more angry, granting forgiveness frees us to live into a more human reality, a more interconnected reality. Not just with those that have hurt, harm, or caused us loss, and that might not even look the same after what's happened. We'll talk about that next week. But within ourselves. So in some real ways, granting forgiveness rehumanizes us. So people of God, are we going to go on this journey? And if we are, let us take that step. Let us grant this forgiveness so that we take back some agency, so that we humanize that other and ourselves, and so that we then pave a more faithful future for us and for all those around us. And when we do that, when we do those things, the journey of healing continues. The opportunity for reconciliation emerges, but also the opportunity of letting go, that agency that we reclaim for us, knowing that at each step of the journey, this process is best lived in community with other fellow workers around us who know what it's like to suffer hurt, harm, and loss, who knows what it's like to grant forgiveness, who know what it's like to rehumanize the other, we together helping one another in this journey towards healing, wholeness, and new life. That right there, that's good news. Thanks be to God. Amen.